Roger Nairn, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast.
Thanks so much, John.
It is a pleasure to be with you. I'm super excited to have a fun conversation about podcasting on the podcast. We're getting meta today. And you're joining us from the Vancouver area. I'm south of Salt Lake City in Utah. We're going to be talking about why companies should start podcasts, both podcasting to establish your brand and to establish yourself as a thought leader, those sorts of things. And how you can measure the ROI of those podcasts, but also how you can utilize podcasting as an internal tool for your organization in terms of leadership and executive development and other such things. So this is what we're going to be exploring together today. As we get started, I wanted to share Roger's bio with everybody. Roger Nairn is a lateral thinker, problem solver, strategist, and finder of new ways. He believes in the power of the happy customer and spent years managing client relationships and building brands for world famous agencies like DDB and Cassette. Throughout his career, he's found himself working with a number of industry giants, including, but certainly not limited to, Netflix, Expedia, Walmart, Nordstrom's, Lamborghini, and Cineplex, 4 Seasons Plus, and Vancouver's own Lululemon. On top of all of this, he followed his passions to become a board member for TEDx Vancouver and has recently become an expert level toddler wrangler through the magic of parenthood. When he's not at work, he likes to golf, read, and, no surprise here, binge the occasional podcast. And that is fantastic. I love your background. I've been a longtime consumer of podcasts for such a long time. And for me, it was the pandemic that launched me into podcasting. I've been a guest on podcasts going back even 10 years. Like I said, I've been listening to them for forever since their inception. But once travel shut down and once I wasn't able to meet, like normally I'm a professor, I'm a consultant, I travel, I go to conferences, I do consulting engagements, speaking engagements, I get to talk to cool people about interesting things. All of a sudden, a lot of that shut down. And I'm like, oh, maybe I should just try my hand at a podcast. And so I started it, and it's just been this fun, organic kind of growth and adventure over the last 2 years. I know my story is a little bit different than other people, but the bottom line is podcasting can be a great tool and it can be a lot of fun. So that's why I've gotten involved. Tell us anything else about yourself, your background, your personal context, before we dive on into the conversation for today.
Awesome. Yeah. So thanks for the intro. Like you mentioned, I came from the advertising world. I spent 20 plus years in client service, working for some of the bigger agencies in North America. Got to work with some incredible brands, and absolutely loved it. But then I got into the sort of like, how can I meet really interesting, fascinating people? And I'm sure, like yourself, jumped into podcasts for that reason. And I started out as an amateur podcaster. I used it as my excuse to reach out to some of my favorite authors and directors and designers, and it worked. I had the most incredible conversations with some of these people. But then I started getting the business itch and teamed up with a couple friends of mine, one who was in the journalism world, came from radio, the other who was deep into the technical side of podcasting. And we went out for beer one night and said, what if we combined our experiences and created essentially a podcast agency that services businesses, helps them get into the podcast space? And that's all we do is help companies get into the podcast space, grow an audience, and really create incredible audio content for them. And that's how Jar Audio was born. We started about 5 years ago off the side of our desks. Literally threw a message onto LinkedIn. Didn't even put it out publicly. I reached out to 8 people on LinkedIn. I said, "Is this kind of business of any interest to you?" The second person who responded that evening was somebody who their partner was working for a company looking to start a podcast. He said, my wife would love it if you could be in the office in a couple days. We said, great. We were in that office. We signed a contract within 24 hours from that. And we literally have built the company since then, just have rolled along. So, I mean, we get really excited because brands are always looking to create audiences. Brands are always looking to own audiences. We're so tied into the programmatic way of buying advertising and getting, our message in front of the right people. It's very much kind of a push medium. It's getting in the way of things. It's kind of annoying. It works, but at the end of the day, you're renting somebody else's audience. You're renting Facebook's audience. You're renting Google's audience. Podcasts allow you to own an audience, build an audience that knows you, trusts you, has a lot of respect for you because you're delivering incredibly valuable content. So we work with brands to uncover who their audience is, what do they need, how can we deliver it, and how can it be in the form of a podcast? And we've had a ton of success to date.
Yeah, I always love the origin stories of new businesses, and so that's fun to hear. And for me, you know, I'm an amateur podcaster. It was totally just a side gig, hobby kind of a thing. I never expected it to really. I just thought it'd be a fun thing to do, and it just kind of grew organically into something that's been, you know, more and more meaningful to me and adding value to other people. So it's been fun to get into. But yeah, the origin stories of any business, I think, are always fun. And it's fascinating, the work that you're doing. So why don't we, as we dive on into the conversation, lay out the why behind why an organization might really consider starting their own podcast or podcasts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, it comes down to the audience. So if you have an audience that you're looking to, you know, engage with, there's really no better medium than a podcast these days. And the numbers kind of prove it. Our podcasts see upwards of a 95, in some cases, 99% listen through rate. Because it's engaging content. It's content designed to educate, entertain, you know, hit those emotional buttons. But also just the medium is very intimate. It's literally in your audience's ears. And so if you build a podcast that respects the listener and is really built to help them or serve them in any fashion, you know, you can be really successful. At the end of the day, it can't be an advertisement. Nobody's going to listen to a 20 or 30-minute ad from American Express all about American Express, but they would listen if they're, you know, let's say a small business owner, they would listen to a podcast about helping small businesses, you know, thrive and succeed. So maybe they'll listen to an episode on cash flow management, or they'll listen to an episode on building a brand, or they'll listen to an episode on, you know, making sure you're aware of and managing your diversity, equity, and inclusion, you know, challenges within the organization. So that's high value. It just happens to be brought to you by a brand. And so we get hired by these companies to come in, really dig into the strategy side of why the podcast needs to exist, what its purpose is, and what it's going to do for the listener. And then we build from there. So we have teams of producers and audio technicians. We've got teams of marketers who craft and create, you know, really high value podcasts that get pushed out to the right ears.
Yeah. Excellent. What goes into creating that successful podcast? Because I mean, there are so many platforms out there. It's much easier to do. The barrier to entry is super low. I mean, it's almost non-existent, right? You spend $50, get some decent equipment.
Yep.
You can join various platforms, many of which are free. Editing software, you know, you can find expensive stuff, but also free stuff. Like the barrier to entry is super low, but obviously, I mean, there's something I'm sure you could tell me, but aren't there like literally millions of active podcasts as we speak, with more launching every day? So clearly, yeah, there's, go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, there's 2 million active podcasts right now. So you need to stand out from the crowd. And the way to do that is with high quality, thoughtful storytelling, great editing, the right host, and the right guests. And so that's what we do. I call ourselves a do it for you agency. We are hired by companies to handle every, you know, aspect of it in full collaboration. You know, we're not just an island and then we kind of say, ta-da, here's a podcast. It's very much a collaborative process. So we're working with marketing teams and communication groups within the company to produce, you know, something great. And so we come in, we do all the strategy side of it. You know, a lot of the heavy lifting comes in things like finding the right host, contracting the right host, you know, producing a season arc, sort of what 12 episodes is going to be like. How does the story either tie together, or how are the bits and pieces of each episode laddering up to the larger sort of brand values of the organization? We're writing scripts, we're finding guests, we're contracting guests, we're making sure guests are pre-interviewed. We do pre-interviews with all of our guests to make sure that we can pull out the nuggets that we want the host to be asking, because we don't script anything as far as, you know, our conversations. We have interview notes or what we would call a question line going into an interview, but otherwise it's fully organic, and we want it to be that way. But we do want to advise our host on sort of like, what are some opportunities that you really want to kind of poke into, make sure you don't miss. Also, though, sometimes when we're pre-interviewing a guest, we're determining, is this going to be a dud conversation? And if so, let's maybe cut this one off, or maybe, say no thank you this time around. We don't want to waste anybody's time, including our clients. And so we're doing, everything from the guest bits up front. We're obviously doing all the recording. We do all of our recording remotely, globally. We ship equipment all around the world. Like you mentioned, equipment is a fairly low barrier to entry. So we'll actually ship equipment to all of our guests to make sure that they have the best quality. We'll work with them to figure out where in their home or office we can get the best quality as well. We've done everything from finding a corner in a closet to making a little bit of a pillow fort. We get it all done. We find that we don't need studios as much as we used to. We're trying to find, kind of organic ways to flow in sort of what we would call texture audio. Maybe we're doing some streeters with some people on the street asking their opinion on something, or maybe we're getting our hosts to walk around day in life with their cell phone and recording themselves. And so we're capturing other audio all the time. And then we're doing the full edit, full music bed, custom music if we need to. And then, getting it online, distributing it, and making sure it's getting to the right audience. But also we have a full marketing team whose role it is to constantly be pushing on a number of different areas to try to get the podcast to the right audience, to as many of them as possible.
Yeah. Awesome. And let's talk about ROI. So, we want to do things that make sense. Everything's give and take, and there's opportunity costs. So if you're spending time and money and budget on developing a podcast and trying to advertise and get it out there and expand your reach and create your brand loyalty and all those things that you were just talking about, clearly that's going to take effort and time and energy and money. How do you know that that's worth it? Now, there are a lot of listener analytics and those sorts of things. You can do traditional marketing analytics and such. Why don't you walk through that with us for just a minute? Some of the types of things that we should be looking at and measuring, maybe those things that really matter versus some things that don't matter as much, though people tend to focus too much on.
Yeah. And I think just in, a classic sort of ex-ad guy's answer is it depends. It depends on the organization. It depends on what the objectives are of the podcast. But on its basic level, the technology is similar to when you post a blog post on a website. You're able to see the analytics behind how many people visited it, read it, all that sort of stuff. Similar to a podcast, we can see how many downloads or streams we had of the show. We're able to see how long people listened for. We're able to see where they dropped off, where they skipped. That's all really valuable information for us because it helps inform future episodes, different creative decisions we make. But then when it comes to like that side of it, yes, of course, you want a big audience. Everyone does. You're never going to be like a Joe Rogan or Tim Ferriss. It's just not going to happen, especially coming from a brand. But you want to see the numbers going up. You want to see bigger number than it was last month. But there's other pieces that we really look at. So, for example, the engagement rate. How long are people listening for? That to us is a real indicator of success, and it is for our clients as well. But then when it comes to like business, the business ROI of it, again, it depends. But if you want to measure, visits to the website, for example, we can do that using technology. We can track conversions all the way from, we can tell who listened to the podcast. Did they go on the website? Did they make a purchase? Did they download a form? Did they do X, Y, and Z? We can measure all that. We can't tell who the specific individual is, but we can tell, kind of by tracking IP addresses. That we're seeing those numbers. And then we've had a lot of clients look at it from like a brand standpoint. So I'll give you a perfect example. We did a podcast for Expedia called Out Travel the System. And they came to us with a brand challenge, which was, we want to be known as a more helpful brand. We want the podcast to help us do that. And so what we did was ran a brand lift study. We pulsed it a few times throughout the course of the season. And one of the questions was, do you see Expedia as a helpful brand? Did the podcast help you get there? Sort of thing. I can't remember the exact question, but that to them, proved the ROI of the podcast. We've done a lot of work with internal podcasts where, it's really about, engagement with staff. How many are listening? How long are they listening? They'll do, their weekly stand-ups, and they'll even ask like questions that were from the podcast to sort of prove that they listened and make sure that the message is getting through. That's another example. So it totally depends, but kind of everything and anything is possible, and we're only limited by technology and creativity.
Yeah, that was a great overview. Like you said, there's so much great data available. Let's have clear objectives on the forefront, so we know what we're looking for,
right?
And then we can put together an assessment strategy to understand the impact in relation to those objectives. That's important in any aspect of business, anything that we're choosing to spend our time on. Certainly that would be the case for podcasting. And so let's be thoughtful about it. It's really a great opportunity, though, a great resource for organizations. It's definitely something I've really enjoyed doing and would highly recommend others giving it a try. You also mentioned, you just for a moment talked about internal use podcasts. And maybe we could just take a few more minutes to talk about that and how those are utilized, because that's becoming more and more popular, where you're not creating a podcast for the general public or for your consumers, your general consumer base, but it's really just for the internal usage as a training tool, as an executive development tool. How have you seen some of your customers utilize it that way?
Yeah, so pre-pandemic, we saw customers using it for the purposes of expanding messages on a global basis. But then once COVID hit, it just really took off beyond that, because you now had a more mobile workforce. You had people working from home, disconnected from that sort of office town hall sort of opportunity. And so the podcast became a really great way to broadcast a range of messages. We've had clients do everything from okay, so Lululemon is a big retail brand. They're based in Vancouver, but they've got staff globally. It's a culture before COVID. It's a culture where the head office was really important to culture, but a lot of their staff felt disconnected from head office, and they would do these monthly sort of leadership events where they would bring in a really famous author, or they'd bring in a yoga master or somebody who has got a really incredible story to tell. They'd bring them up on stage. They'd interview them. It was kind of like a TED Talk sort of style. Well, what we did was we recorded everything on stage, but then we put it into a podcast format. We had our hosts kind of give a little bit of extra color commentary to what went on stage. And then we posted it on their intranet, and it got pushed out globally. We had different language translations and things like that. So the staff globally felt like they were actually there. They could listen to it on the treadmill, before work, brushing their teeth before work, or driving in the car, or commuting into work, or listening at work. And we're under no illusions that you could also do the same thing with video, but they felt like the audience or the staff a lot more tuned into podcasts. They love that sort of freedom of being able to do it anywhere. You can't get that with video. You can't watch a video on a treadmill without throwing up, or nobody's really watching videos while walking their dog. So this gave them just a little bit more freedom. And so the sky's the limits on what can be done. We've had brands roll out sort of new brand strategy, new values and mission and all that sort of stuff, and they've articulated it into a podcast, broadcast it. They've got a lot of like on the ground retail employees as well. We posted QR codes in their break rooms so they could just quickly scan and listen right on the spot. We've had banks do the same thing. They've obviously got huge onboarding programs, and part of the onboarding was listen to the podcast. We can track who's listening just for sort of HR purposes and things like that. And so yeah, there's a ton of different things that can be done. And let's be honest, like you can also send out an email to your entire staff, but there's really not a lot of emotion in that. We're so kind of tired of the CEO message, and this is coming from CEO. We're so kind of tired of the boring sort of flat CEO message. Put the CEO in audio and tell some stories and add some real incredible texture to the episode, and that's where you're going to see the engagement.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's an underutilized tool that more and more people are adopting. Again, barrier to entry super low. Give it a try, and I think you'll find it to be really rewarding and fun, and a great way to expand what you're doing. Well, Roger, it has been a real pleasure. I note the time. I have to let you go here in just a minute. Before we wrap for today, I just wanted to give you a chance to share with listeners how they can connect with you, find out more about your work and your team, and then give us a final word on the topic for today.
For sure. Yeah. Check us out at jaraudio.com. We've got all sorts of great resources on the podcast industry, podcasts for brands and organizations. So check out our blog as well. You can also see us on LinkedIn, and myself personally. Don't hesitate to reach out. I'm also on Twitter, but that's where I do most of my, kind of complaining about being a father and toddler world. And so not as useful, but we're also on Twitter. But ultimately, listen to more podcasts. It helps raise the boats as a whole. And there's a ton of amazing work out there.
Awesome. Thank you, Roger. It's been a real pleasure. I encourage listeners to reach out, get connected, find out more about what Roger and his team can do for you. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week.